Good morning. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Second Corinthians chapter 6. Paul has continued to defend his apostleship and has reminded the brethren in Corinth of some of the things that he had endured through his work for the Lord, through teaching the truth, and even reminded them how he had been made poor while making them rich. Of course, contrasting the physical status with the spiritual, and also described himself as possessing all things as well. He, although having nothing or very little, literally, materially, he says, "I possess all things," or we possess all things. That's in verse 10, 2 Corinthians 6, and verse 10. And then he describes his great love for the brethren there in verse 11. Our mouth is open to you, our heart is enlarged. He's expressing great affection, his innermost feelings, and he describes how if there's any problem between us, is anything restraining our relationship, is not on my part. He has great love for them, and he wants to have full fellowship with them. But some of the Corinthians were drifting away. They started embracing some of the false teachers and accusers and deniers of Paul and so forth. But he's encouraging them to come back and reciprocate the love and affection that he had and had shown for them. He even calls them his children, as speaking to them as a father, his great love and concern for them. Questions, comments? We just started touching verse 14 when we left off last week. What questions, comments do you have up to this point? All right, let's begin reading verse 14, and we'll just read to the end of the chapter. Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness, and what concord hath Christ with Belial, or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. And I will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. And we'll pause there. So backing up to verse 14, he says, be not unequally yoked with unbelievers. I think we briefly mentioned last week that this is a verse that we've all heard, we've all read multiple times and heard quoted and so forth. But what is it really talking about? Be not unequally yoked with unbelievers. Okay, certainly it has to do with partners. I mean, you could apply that in a number of different ways. And I think it can. It should be applied in a number of different ways. But we also need to first think about the immediate context in which it's used and what kind of partner or associate you might be talking about. And that, because if you just read that one, because we're so familiar with this verse, we've heard it so many times, it might seem a little bit out of place. But we need to put it back in its context and consider that first. So remember what Paul's talking about. He'd been defending himself against false accusers. He'd been defending the truth versus those false teachers that had been coming in. So the first application would have to be the unequally yoked with unbelievers. The unbeliever would have to be, in the first application, those teaching false doctrines. That's what Paul's talking about in the context. I think we briefly mentioned last week, we made reference to Deuteronomy 22, verse 10. We won't take the time to go read it again, but the text there describes, and that's the kind of the background of this concept, unequally yoked, where the text there says, don't plow together with an ox and a donkey at the same time. That's an unequal yoke. That's not going to work out very well. And so don't yoke yourself together with someone of a different kind, is the idea there. So the application, first application, false teachers. Don't yoke yourself, connect yourself, bind yourself to someone who's not going to hold to the truth, to someone who's going to pull you away from God through that type of teaching. Now, again, that's the first application, but I don't think it's limited to that. I think it could apply to any unequal yoke with unbelievers, that is non-Christians. So any relationship that would cause a Christian to hold to that unbeliever over holding to God, that's an unequal yoke. Or a relationship with an unbeliever that would cause him or her to participate in ungodly practices or neglect Christian responsibilities and things of that nature. Don't be unequally yoked to unbelievers. Don't help an evil cause that's opposing God. Now, back up with me a minute and let's think about it further. Does this mean that we cannot associate with people who are not Christians? Doesn't mean that at all, does it? We need to understand the difference, because it's easy to take that step. Well, that's not the step Paul took, though. It does not mean that you cannot associate with non-Christians. In fact, hold your finger here. Somebody go read for me 1 Corinthians, excuse me, 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. While you're turning there, I'll remind you the context. This is the context of where there was a man in Corinth, a member of the church there, who was living in fornication. Okay, not repenting of it. The church there was not doing anything about it. And they were even puffed up. Look, the idea is, look how accepting we are. We know he's in sin, but we're not going to do anything about it. We're going to accept him. And Paul's instructing them, that's not the attitude to have. You need to take some church discipline, withdraw fellowship, and even uses the terminology, cast him to Satan and so forth. But what does he say in verse 10? He talks about how you not to have fellowship with various sinners in the church. But what's he say in verse 10? 1 Corinthians 5, verse 10. Who's got it?
Verse 9, I wrote unto you an epistle not to company with fornicators, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world.
Thank you, sir. So he's not just talking about any sinner that you're supposed to withhold fellowship. Because if you didn't associate with any sinner, you don't have any relationships outside the church. Besides people that are cleansed and striving to walk in the light. You can't even go to the grocery store. That's the idea. You would have to go out of the world. So he's not forbidding association with people who are non-believers. Okay? Now, let's think about more applications. 3 main categories of applications I wrote down here. Number 1 is the first application that we already talked about. Okay? False teachers. People promoting false worship and false practices, false methods of salvation, and all that. Okay, don't hook yourself to them. They're going to bring you away from God. Okay, that's the first application. That's what Paul's talking about in the immediate context. Second application, I would apply this to work. Employers. What do I mean by that? Well, does it happen that there are some employers, some businesses that have immoral, dishonest business practices? That does happen, doesn't it? What if that employer is going to require you to participate in that dishonest, immoral practice? Should you yoke yourself to them so strongly that you are required to do that and drift away from God? No, I think there's an application here for that. Don't yoke yourself. Don't have an unequal yoke where you feel obligated to go along with their immorality and their dishonest business practices. Okay, don't be a part of that. Another side of that same concept with employers, maybe they're not practicing dishonest, immoral business practices, unethical things. Maybe they're not doing that. But what if your boss is demanding so much of your time you don't have time for the Lord? Should you yoke yourself to that person so much that you can't give time to the Lord? That's something to think about, because that might be even more common than the first application that I gave concerning employers. When we have a job that demands so much of our time that we can't attend worship or can't participate in other activities of the church and have fellowship with the brethren that is essential to Christian living, that's a problem. That might be an unequal yoke. Now, third application. We might apply this. So the question often comes up, what about marriage? What about a husband and wife? What if you got one that's a Christian and one that's not a Christian? Is that an unequal yoke? Let me first say, that's not the immediate context. We already talked about the immediate context. But is there an application to that? It could be. It could be. It could apply. Now, did Paul forbid marriage between a Christian and a non-Christian? No, he didn't. In fact, go back to 1 Corinthians 7, verses 14 and 15. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 14 and 15.
The unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. God hath called us to peace.
Thank you, sir. So the marriage between that non-Christian and the Christian, the marriage is clean. Paul did not condemn that type of marriage. Now, I think there are biblical principles, as well as my personal opinion, that it's a very unwise thing for a faithful Christian to marry someone who is not a faithful Christian. I think that's unwise. I think there are biblical principles that would support that. But is it a sin? The Bible doesn't teach that. Okay, that's two different things. Now, but is there an application, though, concerning this unequal yoke for a marriage between a Christian and a non-Christian? I think there could be. Obviously, not always is it an unequal yoke, because Paul didn't condemn that type of marriage. However, don't be so tied to a spouse or anyone that you feel the need to go with them rather than going with God. In fact, the text that we read from 1 Corinthians 7 there said, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. Don't be so bound to that word bondage in that text that Clifton read for us. That word bondage is not referring to the marriage bond. It's referring to being so tied to that person that you feel like you've got it's a stronger bond with them than God. Don't be so tied to them that you're going to leave God for them. No, don't do that. And I think that's a similar principle to what we're talking about here. It's an unequal yoke. All right, questions, comments? That's a good question. And I can't spend a lot of time on it, but we'll briefly talk about that. You go quickly back to 1 Corinthians 7. Right. We read from verses 14 and 15. If the unbeliever depart, let him depart. For a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Remember, the word bondage is not talking about the marriage bond. So he's not saying you're not married to that person anymore. He didn't say that. He says you're not so bound to the person that you have to leave God for that person. So no, it's not saying that marriage is no longer valid. It's saying you don't need to leave God for that person. So he's not giving another reason for a divorce, but don't leave God to go with that person. Well, we can talk about that more later if you'd like to. But no, it's not giving another reason for a divorce. What are the questions, comments? You're exactly right. And unwise for, but not necessarily sinful for a Christian to marry a non-Christian, but I think very unwise. Mm-hmm. Okay, and certainly, if when you got two non-Christians who are married and one learns the truth and obeys, obviously it's still a valid marriage, obviously, and you're already in that marriage. But still, Paul or the Lord or nobody inspired writer condemned a marriage in any sense between a marriage between a Christian and non-Christian, but the application would apply with his unequal yoke. Don't be so tied to that person that you feel like you need to leave God for them. Now he continues this with a series of rhetorical questions. All of the answers is going to be none, essentially, as you see these rhetorical questions. He says, "What fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness?" Well, none. And the word righteousness, the word unrighteousness there, literally lawlessness. What fellowship hath righteousness with lawlessness or unright? Well, doesn't have any. So don't be unequally yoked. Don't tie yourself to someone who's lawless, who's against the law of God, in such a way that you feel like you need to go with them. What communion has light with darkness? That word communion is very much like the word fellowship. Togetherness. It can do light and dark mix. I mean, when you turn on a light, the darkness dispels. You can't mix them. So there's no fellowship, no communion there. Same concept with the righteousness and unrighteousness. And in fact, that reminded me of text in both John. Somebody get these two texts for me real quick. John 1, verse 5, and also 1 John 1, verse 5. John 1, verse 5, and then 1 John 1, verse 5. There's no fellowship there, is there, between light and darkness? And somebody get 1 John 1, verse 5. Of course, that's in God being light, that's the epitome of righteousness and holiness. How much darkness is? Well, none, because you can't mix light with darkness. Now, in fact, we won't take the time to read this one, but you look at Ephesians 5, verse 8. Ephesians 5, verse 8, Christians came out of darkness. Of course, darkness symbolizing evil, symbolizing sin. When you're a Christian, you need to come out of that and be there with God in the light. And he continues in verse 15, and what agreement, what concord hath Christ with Belial? What's Belial? What's that talking about? Say again? Demon, okay, in a sense. It literally means worthlessness or wickedness, but it's a term that the Jews used to refer to Satan. Or to describe Satan. There is no agreement, no concord between Christ and Satan. Well, if there's no agreement, no harmony between Christ and Satan, well, how can the children of God have fellowship with children of Satan? Well, you can't. That's the point. There's no agreement there. Then continuing in the second half of verse 15, he says, "Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel?" Well, again, the rhetorical question, none. He that believeth, the faithful, with the infidel. That word infidel, the King James uses the word infidel at the end of verse 15. It's the same word used in verse 14 for unbeliever. Same word. Literally means faithless. The infidel, the unbeliever, the faithless. What agreement, what part does a believer have with an unbeliever, the faithless? None. That's the point. Don't yoke yourself in such a way where you feel like you need to go with that person and drift away from God. Don't do it. Don't have part with sin. And then another rhetorical question in verse 16. "And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols?" Reference back to the Old Testament. Was the temple there for idols? No. That was God's temple. It was certainly not a place for false worship, to worship anyone other than the true and living God. Rhetorical questions here, but he's making them see the point that he's making. And then he continues that concept. What agreement hath the temple of God with idols? Well, obviously none. The temple's for God. And then he says, "For ye are the temple of the living God." Don't bring or don't allow anything to be in God's place in your life. Don't choose anyone or anything over Him. Something else I think is worth mentioning in this. We mentioned there were many false teachers in Corinth trying to lead people away from the new covenant teaching. What were many of those false teachers teaching? We've talked about that before. In various aspects of the law of Moses, going back to the old system. And he says here, "You are the temple of God." That would be a slap in the face to those Judaizing teachers, because they were teaching the old temple. That's where worship is. He said, "You are the temple of God." Of course, he's talking about the church. Them as the church, you are the temple of God. There were many of those false teachers who were still holding that physical temple. But the church is God's temple. Christians, God's temple. That's where God's fellowship is. And notice the contrast here as well. You are the temple of the, and then he adds a word in there, not just the temple of God, but the temple of the living God, in contrast to all those false gods. The living God. And then we have a quote from multiple Old Testament passages. These words are found numerous times in the Old Testament. And Paul's quoting them here. "As God has said, multiple occasions, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." And then he continues with the quote, "Wherefore come out from among them, be separate, saith the Lord. Touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. And I'll be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and my daughters." And again he says, "saith the Lord Almighty." So he reminds them who said this at the beginning of the quote. He reminds them again at the end of the quote. These are the words of God. We find them in the Old Testament. We won't take the time to read them, but I'll give you a few examples of where you can find these words in the Old Testament. Leviticus 26, verses 11 and 12. Exodus 29, verse 45. And also a couple of times in Ezekiel 11:20, and then Ezekiel 37:27 as well. And this is said multiple times concerning physical Israel, but how does the Apostle Paul apply it here? Not to physical Israel, to spiritual Israel, which is what? The church. The body of Christ, the kingdom of God, the church. God's special people in His fellowship. He's dwelling among them, and He desires to dwell among them. Be faithful to Him. Don't have part in sin. Don't yoke yourself so strong to someone, anyone, where you feel like you need to follow them away from God. Allow God to dwell with you. Be God's temple. Questions, comments? Notice this terminology in verse 17. He says, come out, as he's quoting, of course, but still applying it to God's people today, the church. Come out from among them. That's not an optional thing, is it? That's a command. Come out from among sinners. Don't be numbered with them. Don't count yourselves among unbelievers, among sinners. Also, when I thought about this, what does the word church mean? The called out. He says, come out, be called out, be the church. Get away from sin. Get away from uncleanness. And God makes a promise. If you'll be separate, He says that in verse 17, be ye separate. If you'll do that, if you'll be holy, if you'll be saints, and that's what those words mean, holy, the word holy, the word saint, separated from the world for God's purpose. If you'll be holy, if you'll be a saint, if you'll be separate from the world, and what does God promise? I will be a father unto, verse 18, I'll be a father unto you. And you'll be my sons and daughters. God's making promises here. Now, are those promises just guaranteed no matter what, or are they conditional? It's conditional, isn't it? It's contingent upon our separating ourselves from uncleanness, from sin, from the unrighteousness, from someone who might lead us away from God. An unequal yoke. Questions, comments? I'm going to go read one verse in chapter 7 because this chapter break should probably be after this verse 1 because it's a continuation. So chapter 7 verse 1 says, having therefore these promises, what promises? Well, the promises you just said in verse 18. Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. You've got these promises of God that He'll be your Father, that you can be His sons and daughters. So do what? You've got these promises, so respond how? Be cleansed. Let's cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of flesh and spirit. Perfecting holiness in the fear of God. A few passages here I want to take note of concerning cleansing ourselves, keeping ourselves away from sin. I got three passages if a few people will help out here. Romans 6, verses 1 and 2. Romans 6, verses 1 and 2. Colossians 3, verses 5 and 6. Colossians 3, 5 and 6. Then James 1:27. James 1:27. All right, who's got Romans 6, 1 and 2?
What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. how shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein?
The Christian life is not a sinful life. I'm going to say that again, brethren. I'm going to say that. The Christian life is not a sinful life. Now, does that mean we're perfect, that we never sin? It's not what that means. But if we're living in sin, we are sinful, full of sin, well, we're not living a Christian life. Get out of that. If we're living in sin, we're not dead to sin, as the text in Romans 6 says. Get that out of your life. Be different from the world. Who's got Colossians 3, 5 and 6? Concupiscence. Mm-hmm. Thank you, sir. First word in that text is the word mortify. What does that word mortify mean? Put it to death. And then he lists some sins there. Put those things to death. If we're still actively engaging in those things, guess what we have not done? We have not put that to death. We have not mortified those things. Again, the Christian life is not a sinful. No, we're not perfect, but we are not to be living in sin. Keep yourselves away from it. One more verse. James 1, verse 27. Okay. For our purposes right now, we're focusing on the last part of that. Keeping oneself what? Unspotted from the world. Sometimes sin is referred to as a stain, a spot, and so forth. Keep yourself away from that. And then he says, coming back to our text here in 2 Corinthians, as we've gone into chapter 7 now, in verse 1, perfecting holiness. All right, cleanse yourself from all the filthiness of the flesh. Get that sin away from you. Cleanse yourself. Perfecting holiness. What does that mean, perfecting holiness? Okay, constantly making yourself better. That's a good way to put it. What's another term for perfecting? We're not talking about being sinless. What does perfecting mean? Completing, making whole. Holy, and we defined the word holy just a minute ago. What does that word mean? Very much associated with the word saint. What does it mean? To be separate. To be separate from the world of sin. To be separated for God's use, for His purpose. Perfecting holiness, bringing complete holiness, moral purity, separation from sin. Using your life from God, for God. Getting away from the pollution, that stain, as the text sometimes describes it. And then at the end of verse 1, chapter 7, verse 1, he says, in the fear of God. Doing all these things, recognizing the promises of God that He'll be your father, you can be His sons, His daughters. So get out of sin, separate yourself from the world of sin in the fear of God. What's another term for fear in this type of context? Respect, reverence, having tremendous awe. I think that's the idea here, having reverential awe and respect for God. Because of this reverence, this awe, this recognition of who God is versus who we are, because of that, submit to Him. In the fear of God, submit to Him. And when we do that, how are we going to live? Well, in accordance with His will, which means we're not going to be living in sin. Living according to His will, not our own. Mary. That's the idea. As I said, we're not perfect. We're not perfect in the sense that we never sin. That's not what we're talking about. That's not the way the word is being used here. We're talking about being making ourselves whole by separating ourselves from the world, not being completely sinless. We stumble from time to time, and that's what I'm often make reference to 1 John 1 and verse 7, and there's a reason I do that a lot, is because the blood of Christ is constantly cleansing us when we're doing what? Walking in the light. Walking in the light doesn't mean we're sinlessly perfect. If we were sinlessly perfect, we wouldn't need that blood constantly cleansing us. You think about it. If we are sinless, do we need a Savior? We don't. If you're sinless, you don't need a Savior. The reason we need a Savior is because we do sin. We have committed sin. Now, when we commit ourselves to God, those sins should get fewer and fewer as we grow closer and closer to Him. But as we're walking in the light, we recognize I still stumble. And that's the Apostle John talking there. And he says, we need this. If we say we have no sin, we're liars. Go ahead. Yeah. Fall back, stumble, revert. Yeah. And yes, and that's a process. Addiction is a process. That's not something that boom overnight. Well, I'm done. That's a process, and I think there's an application to that here. We're striving to walk in the light. I recognize I'm not perfect, but I'm getting there. I'm working closer and closer to God, although I'm not perfect. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Right. Good point. Good point. Good point. And that brings another thought that I think I need to clarify. This is not to be used as an excuse. Well, I'm not perfect. Well, I'm just going to continue in sin. No. In fact, that goes back to what Clifton read, I think, in Romans 6. How can we that are dead to sin continue living it? No, don't use that as an excuse. Well, I'm not perfect. I'm going to sin. No, that's not an excuse. We're striving to get better, although we still stumble from time to time. We are striving to get closer to God and eliminate sin from our lives. It's not just an excuse. Well, I'm not perfect. God's grace will cleanse me. Paul condemned that mindset in Romans 6. What other questions, comments do you have? Try to get one more verse here. Chapter 7, verse 2. Receive us. We have wronged no man. We have corrupted no man. We have defrauded no man. When I read those words, receive us, literally, it's the same type of idea from go back to chapter 6 and verses 11 and 12, where Paul says, our mouth is open to you, our heart is enlarged. Literally the same type of mindset there. In fact, some translations say, open your hearts to us. Receive us, open your hearts to us. And Paul desires reciprocation for his love, his affection, his desire to have a close bond with them. He wants that returned to Him. Receive us. What wrong have we done to you? Of course, they haven't done. He hasn't done any wrong. Paul not only desires that they be saved, he desires to have a close relationship with them, a bond with them. He loved them. Love me in return is the idea. Receive us. Open your hearts to us. And there were several who had, and as we read in the Old Testament, who had similar accusations made against them or false or wrong perspectives. And we haven't wronged you. We're trying to help you. We'll talk about that more, Lord willing, next time. But there were a number of others who had similar struggles with the people they're trying to help. All right. Thank you, class. Lord willing, we'll continue there next week.